Hey everyone, good to see you. Hope everybody's doing well and staying healthy. Welcome to our second video in what I think we should call our fireside chat series. So last time we talked about the political and economic issues. Today we're going to talk about some big picture stuff and cultural experiences from the 1920s. We're also going to create one for the Great Depression. Talks about the causes of the Great Depression, some of the experiences during the Great Depression. And then we'll do one final one on World War II, how and why we got involved in World War II. I think that'll be a two-parter. But we'll roll those out over the next week or so. So anyway, get your notebook ready and off we go. When last we left off, we were talking about the economic and political nature or character of the 1920s. So we're talking about Warren G. Harding, Coolidge. We were talking about kind of the economic behaviors that were happening. I'd like to talk now about our dealings with foreign nations and then go after some of the cultural experiences in the 1920s. So first of all, the United States was very much becoming isolationist. If you remember at the end of World War I, as Wilson was trying to get the U.S. to sign the Treaty of Versailles, we had interventionists, we had reservationists, and we had isolationists. Well, we really embraced that idea of isolationism in the 1920s. And you can see that with the Washington Naval Conference. So we talked about that before, trying to limit the amount of bases abroad, limit the number of ships for war that were being created, and trying to have open access to China. So trying to kind of ease those tensions that we perceived as bringing us into World War I. However, at the exact same time, we end up in this economic battle with our allies from World War I. We had talked about that the Allies borrowed money and war supplies from the United States in the lead up to World War I. After World War I and during the 1920s, the United States demanded that the Allies pay back their loans. The Allies' response to this was that the United States entered into the war late, right? So we entered in 1917. And the Allies' view was that the Allies had paid for the war in blood, and that the United States should pay for the war in terms of the loans and should forgive the loans. However, the United States did not agree with that and demanded that the loans be paid back. So the Allies turned to Germany to force them to pay their war reparations in the hopes that if Germany pays the war reparations, the Allies can use that money to then pay back the United States for the loans. However, what had happened because of the League of Nations turning into a beat up on Germany club, the German economy was decimated, and I know you guys have studied that stuff before, so Germany doesn't really have the money to pay back the war reparations. So what's developed in the United States is something called the Dawes Plan. Please keep in mind this is different than the Dawes Severalty Act, which dealt with Native Americans, right, and forced assimilation. The Dawes Plan was almost like a Ponzi scheme, but on an international scale. So the idea was the United States would give loans to Germany. Germany would use that money to pay back the war reparations to the Allies, and then the Allies would funnel that money back to the United States to pay off the loans taken on during the war. While on paper it seems like the United States loans are being paid back, really what's happening is money is being shuffled around and no value is being added to the money. So no goods are being produced, no additional revenues being generated. It's just money being passed around from one country to the other, making it look like all of the debts and the loans and all that sort of being paid off. That's going to be one of the theories, or add to one of the theories, as to why the stock market crashes in the United States and it leads to this global depression. And we'll come back to that a little bit later on. And then regarding isolationism, we even go as far as to work with France to create one of the most ridiculous pieces of legislation called the Kellogg-Brandt Act. So basically what that did was outlaw the use of war to address conflict. The reason why I say that it's a little bit of an absurd bit of legislation is war in reality is violation of legislation, violation of international law, right? And we were trying to legislate our way out of war. And as you all know, starting in 1939, it's very, very clear that that's not going to work. And we had previously talked about how Coolidge had very little interest in foreign affairs overall. Now, when we take a look at next slide, there we go. At home, the 1920s is often referred to as an end of progressivism. So when we talk about big trends in the United States, we talk about progressive changes and conservative reactions throughout American history. We see the progressive era in the 1920s, prior to the 1920s, reshape our expectation of the role of government. In the 1920s, we revert back to a much more laissez-faire policy. This time period is often referred to as a return to normalcy, and that's a reference to a word used in Harding's speech, where after World War I, he's referencing going back to a time where we weren't involved on the world stage and not getting involved in these European conflicts, but in reality also referencing a time period before the progressive era, right? And so we see that occur, right? We see a return of the old guard. And we had talked about old guard with McKinley and Roosevelt, right? And the kind of tear that happens in the Republican Party in the 1912 election. The old guard returns to Congress. We have three conservative judges that are appointed, and their decisions stop some of the progressivism that occurred, right? So child labor comes back into action. We had talked about the Mueller case protecting women's working conditions. That gets rolled back. So we actually see judicial decisions that roll back some of that progressivism. And as we had talked about at the beginning of the school year, this is also a time period of xenophobia, right? We fear of outsiders. Just, I guess, ironic if nothing else, the flu pandemic that occurred in 1918, right? We label it the Spanish flu. And so we blame outsiders for bringing this mortal threat to us. We have an increase in nativism, right? Anti-immigration. We pass immigration laws in the 1920s that restrict access to the United States to what are referred to as the new immigrants. So those folks from Eastern and Southern Europe coming to the United States. We see cases like the Sacco and Vanzetti case, targeting Italians who were anarchists, but very questionable in terms of whether or not they had committed crime, eventually being executed. And generally the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti is referred to as the end of this time period of the Red Scare. Also during the Red Scare, we have a lot of anti-labor movement going on in the 1920s because those folks like Eugene Debs and the unions that we saw develop at the end of the 19th century. There's a real pushback against these demands for workers' rights. Good. So let's also talk about some of the major cultural movements that occur. I do have a few political cartoons that we'll take a look at regarding the Red Scare. So let's take a look at those first. Now, the College Board's test has changed. Who knows what you guys are going to see come the time of the test, but here are some famous political cartoons from the 1920s referencing this end of progressivism, pushing back against labor, and some of the xenophobia associated with the Red Scare. All right, so cultural movements in the 1920s. We talked about Prohibition and the attempt to legislate morality with passage of the 18th Amendment and then the Volstead Act, right, trying to require us to pull away from drinking. And the reality is it has unintended consequences. So overnight, it makes the majority of Americans criminals. And they don't give up the booze, but in reality, they actually increase the consumption, or at least who was more willing to consume alcohol. We talked about how prior to Prohibition, mostly just men drank. It was kind of much more socially acceptable for men to drink, but after Prohibition, is passed in the Volstead Act, now women start drinking as well. So this idea of making people criminals for their personal behavior opens up the door to throw out other cultural norms that we've talked about ever since Abigail Adams reminding the framers of the Constitution to remember the women. Now in 1920, women get the right to vote. And then this idea of throwing out other cultural norms. You guys are familiar with the flapper movement, right? So women cut their hair, they start wearing short dresses and skirts and go out and experience much more of a social liberation in the 1920s. So another cultural movement that we see occur is the idea of pragmatism coming to the forefront, and you see that specifically with education. So John Dewey, he was an educational philosopher who believed that students learn best by doing. And so an example would be running labs in science class, in social studies, doing debates and discussions instead of just listening to the teacher talk to you like you are right now. But they actually work with the content, and by doing that they learn how to analyze material, pull it into its individual pieces, and come to conclusions. And you see the role of pragmatism play out in the Scopes monkey trial, right? So it's conflict between what was being taught in schools and what could be banned from being taught in schools. So Tennessee had passed a state law making it illegal to teach about evolution in the classroom. Scopes was accused of teaching evolution, and the reality is whether or not he did or did not, he chose to turn this into an issue, and the modernists who were trying to bring pragmatism into education saw this as an opportunity to take it to a national level and try and improve education. What came of the trial itself was actually very little, right? So Scopes technically admitted to violating the law, therefore the courts looked at it and said, yep, you violated the law, you're going to be fined. Eventually the fine was overturned. But what comes from this is the public seeing the conflict between traditionalist and modernist views. William Jennings Bryan, who we've been introduced to before, he argues the case of creationism, right? The more traditional approach to where humans came from. And Clarence Darrow then argues for the more modernist approach of evolution. And Clarence Darrow is able to back Bryan, the fundamentalist, into a corner, basically getting him to admit that he believed that everything that was said in the Bible was true fact, but yet at the same time was meant as storytelling and basically helped discredit the argument that Bryan was trying to make. What's interesting is that because no final decision was made at the court level, they just kind of ended up kicking it out. Yep, you violated the law. End of story. No decision was finally made about whether or not evolution can be taught in the classroom. And so it's still left up to state by state in our country and school district by school district in our country in some places, like in Pennsylvania. But we see this clash between modernists and traditionalists. And you really see that clash happen when it comes to rebellion in the arts. So let's talk about the Harlem Renaissance. Harlem Renaissance is one of the major cultural expressions that occurs in the United States, right? So we had kind of the Second Great Awakening material back in the 19th century. We had the rise of pro-nationalism after the War of 1812, Hudson River School of Painting. Now we have the Harlem Renaissance, and the Harlem Renaissance is directly tied to a lot of the tensions and life experiences that were occurring in rural South at the end of the 19th century. So let's talk kind of an overview of Harlem Renaissance. First of all, a truly national cultural phenomenon. So it's referred to as Harlem because it borrows the name of Harlem, New York, one of the places where this cultural expression began, but it was happening all over, primarily northern cities throughout the country. it is an explosion in the arts. So we have literature and sculpture and painting and musical expression that comes out of this, and a lot of that artistic expression that begins here in the 1920s and blossoms in the 1930s will have long-standing impact on cultural behavior in the United States. It is the root of rock and roll music, of hip hop, of various different cultural and musical expressions that we see in the United States. And these cultural expressions actually had international influence. I know some of you have seen the film Swing Kids, about the youth pushing back against fascism in Nazi Germany. I know some folks who had Mr. Smythe in class, I think you guys had watched a little bit of this. They were called the Swing Kids because they listened to swing music. And swing music was directly tied to, it was birthed to by the Harlem Renaissance. So let's go back and let's talk about what leads to the Harlem Renaissance, the roots of it. We had already talked about some of the pressures that the farming community was facing in the 1920s. A lot associated with this post-World War I era, and then also some of the farming behaviors and economic problems that had started to occur. But what we didn't discuss before is the impact that it will then have in the rural South. So we had talked about how after Civil War, during Reconstruction, and even post-Reconstruction, those who had been in power in the South prior to Civil War, right? Those Redeemer governments come back into power following Reconstruction, and we talked about the use of black codes, those labor codes, and Jim Crow laws, segregationist laws, and the effort by those in power to try and keep those formerly enslaved as close to the position of slavery as they could legally. And so when we then in the 1920s have this fallout associated with the agricultural community, it directly has an impact on the African Americans in the South, because the loans start getting pulled up on land, and the white landowners who had been using sharecropping, right, to tie African American families to the soil, they then are foreclosing on the land. Therefore, they're kicking the black families off of the land, and you have this real void that starts to occur in the rural South. And so this will be one of the push factors to encourage what is known as the Great Migration, right? So push factors in the South: racism, the KKK, the limited economic advancement open, and now the crumbling agricultural economy is going to be a push factor. What's a pull factor? Well, if we look at the pull factors up in the north, we have a more industrialized economy. So jobs opening up in factories. We already talked about how the economy was booming in the 1920s with production of consumer products. Also, the perception that up north, racism would be less if they could just get, if the African American families could just get themselves out of that southern racist lifestyle. They would be able to be more or face greater equality when they came up north. And we talked about this before when we talked about abolitionism, right? Paget had referred to as racism was equal in the United States, the degree of racism. It was the target of the racism, right? That in the South, Paget had said that Southerners loved the individuals but hated the race, and Northerners loved the race but hated the individual. And so one of the pull factors up north is this perception that the North is going to be less racist, more integrated. And the reality is that there's an equal amount of racism that is faced when African American families come up north, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. So here's a nice map to display the major demographic shift that occurs in the United States. So technically, Great Migration, 1916 to 1930, right? So that World War I boom in the industry all the way up through the stock market crash and the 1930s. And so what happens is, as families move up north, segregation, whether de jure or de facto, still existed up north. In many places it was de facto, right? So not by law, but by tradition. And what happens is African American families come up into these urban regions and they cluster in African American communities for the support system, right? And also being pushed out of white regions. And the segregation that then is experienced in the North actually helps open doors for the Harlem Renaissance. This cultural experience of embracing and celebrating African American experiences is in part fed by the fact that communities were coming together with a shared common purpose and a shared experience up north and begin to celebrate the cultural interactions and achievements that have occurred in the United States. And so we'll take a look at some of those examples. So I'd like to throw out just a thesis. If nothing else, we don't really have the ability to run through the lesson as I would like usually, but here's one of my arguments: that many elements of the Harlem Renaissance arose as modernist reactions to traditionalist values, right? So think of it from that perspective, that the 1920s was this moment of traditionalism and modernism culturally clashing. We see that with Prohibition, gender roles, and experiences of Harlem Renaissance. And that conflict then has shaped American pop culture for nearly the last 100 years. That a lot of the cultural experiences or pop cultural experiences that we have today are very much rooted in this Harlem Renaissance. Now, a number one person that I would say you need to know for Harlem Renaissance in terms of literature is Langston Hughes. So Langston Hughes, at a very young age, began writing poetry that encapsulates the Harlem Renaissance. I've included audio recordings of Langston Hughes actually reading two of his more famous poems up in Schoology. So please take a listen to them. They're very quick, but listen for the celebration of African American tradition. And it's important to note, like the first example that you have, he was only 19 years old when he wrote it. 23 when he wrote the second example that I provide to you. And what is a 19-year-old, 23-year-old doing at this time period in the United States? Where are they spending their time? They're in these speakeasies, right? It's Prohibition, right? Because of the segregation that is still experienced up north. These are African American speakeasies, right? And so he's within this cultural experience where he then starts crafting his poetry and that celebration. And what is he doing in these speakeasies? He's also listening to the influence of blues and jazz. So let's talk about that a little bit. We get a uniquely American musical tradition, and that tradition is blues. Jazz is a combination of that blues musical tradition and influence of like ragtime and classical music and all of these other genres of music. But out of the Harlem Renaissance comes blues and jazz. And blues and jazz has been referred to as the African American voice scored as band music specifically for jazz, right? So blues is the celebration and recognition of the struggles that African American communities were going through in that movement from the rural South to the urban North. For those of you who are familiar with jazz music, a lot of traditional jazz, you can actually hear in the back rhythms and in some of the notes from horns, sounds of trains. And so oftentimes in jazz, there'll be a da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da rhythm to it. And that was created to replicate the sound of movement of trains. And then the horns will also oftentimes go bop, bop. And that's the sound of the train horn. And so the actual instruments in jazz reflect that great migration and the riding of the rails from the rural South to the urban North. And we also talked about the fact that racism is being experienced both in the South, and the North. And we discussed at the beginning of the school year the rise of the Klan during this time period and actions by the Klan. The increase in lynchings of African Americans, both North and South, occur in the 1920s. And one of the most haunting songs, the one I believe I have attached in Schoology, is performed by Billie Holiday, is the song Strange Fruit, describing seeing a lynching. And so blues and jazz comes out of this time period of modernist behavior, challenging traditionalist actions, and we see this cultural expression that then has an influence for generations to come. And here are some paintings, just a selection of some of the paintings that come from the Harlem Renaissance. And you can see the bold use of color and challenging the traditional style of painting at the time, right? All right, guys, that's a wrap. Thanks for joining us, and we'll have a couple other videos coming out in the near future. Next week we have spring break happening, so I hope you have a great spring break. Get outside, get a breath of fresh air, and then we'll get back to it real soon. We'll be in a good spot for the AP test, and yeah, looking forward to it. Take care.